So, Norm, I know you'll be listening later. We are now telling you, you got a big demerit tonight. Exodus. It's been a long time since we've studied Exodus, and it is a long book. As I mentioned, it's going to take us a little while to get through it. There's so much in this book. But yet, Exodus is not a beginning, and actually there is no end. It just continues the story from Genesis. It just continues that account. And we finish up Genesis, it says, and the seed of Abraham spent 400 years in Egypt. All right. Over in Exodus 12:40, it says it was 430 years, and Galatians 3:16 and 17 confirms that. It was 430 years from the call of Abraham, and 400 years from the time that God told Abraham these things. 400 years, a long time that they were in Egypt. Exodus means the way out, and God gave them a way out. It tells the story of redemption, and it's a story that's not popular because it involves blood. And people today just do not want to hear about the blood. But it's by the blood and the power of God here. The message of Exodus actually is told over in Hebrews 11, beginning at verse 23. It says this: by faith Moses, when he was born, was hid 3 months of his parents. And because they saw he was a proper child, and they were not afraid of the king's commandment, by faith Moses, when he was come to years, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to suffer affliction with the people of God than to enjoy the pleasures of sin for a season, esteeming the reproach of Christ greater riches than the treasures of Egypt. For he had respect unto the recompense of the reward. By faith he forsook Egypt, not fearing the wrath of the king. For he endured as seeing him who was invisible. Through faith he kept the Passover and the sprinkling of the blood, lest he that destroyed the firstborn should touch them. By faith he passed through the Red Sea as by dry land, which the Egyptians, assaying, were drowned. That tells us the story, reaffirms it. He puts Moses' life very quickly there in Hebrews, but it tells us all we need to know. The word that opens the book of Hebrews is the word now, but it's better translated and as a connection. And these are the names of the children of Israel, as if it connects Genesis with this book. Remember, Moses is the author, and it is, I guess we can call it today, there's always, if there's a popular movie, they always have a sequel. And in most cases, the sequel isn't as good as the original, but here is the sequel to Genesis, and it is just as good, if not better. So it is not a commencing, it's not a fulfillment, as I said. It tells us that 70 souls of Jacob entered Egypt. Now, conservatively thinking here and figuring, from 70 souls that entered, approximately 2 million left Egypt. It's impossible to be certain about the dates of this. We can come pretty close. It would seem that Joseph entered Egypt under the shepherd kings. These were not real Egyptians. These were Semitic conquerors, and they could have been related somewhere down the line to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. That doesn't mean they're from the family, but there's some relationship there. They were not Egyptians that we see coming later. The Israelites actually may have been their only friends because they were hated by the Egyptian nationals, if you will, for lack of a better term. Finally, those kings were driven out by a native Egyptian dynasty, which was very hostile to foreigners. In this line, we're going to see that Pharaoh was a Pharaoh that rose, and we're told, who knew not Joseph. And of course, Moses figures prominently in Exodus. From beginning to end, he is the prominent human character. He is the author of the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible, the books of the law: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. In the book of Exodus, Moses' life is divided into 3 40-year segments. And we're going to see that especially the first 40 years moves very quickly in the account in Exodus. That's the 40 years in the palace of Pharaoh's daughter there in Egypt. Then he's going to spend 40 years in the desert of Midian, and then 40 years in the wilderness as the leader of the nation. Can you imagine being called at the age of 80 to go back and lead your people out of captivity? It's amazing to me. I can't imagine doing that at 80. But God used everything in his life to bring him to that point. Whether you realize it or not, Moses' training in Egypt was probably in the temple of the sun, Ra, one of their gods. And that didn't prepare him for God, the one true God, and leading his people out of Egypt. God did the training of Moses in the desert there at Midian. He revealed to him that he was to be the one, but he couldn't do it on his own. That is, free Israel. God gave Moses really a degree over there, a BD degree, the backside of the desert. God taught him what he needed to know. People don't realize that 40 years, what was he doing there? He was learning the land. He knew what was there. He knew where Sinai was. He knew the routes. He had become very familiar. It should be noted that after God prepared Moses to deliver the people, he sent him back to Egypt after 40 years had passed. So Moses was to assemble a group of elders, and he was to go before Pharaoh and say, "Let my people go." But Pharaoh, of course, did not do that. He refused to consent. He started a contest, basically, between God and the false gods of Egypt. When we see the plagues, we're going to notice that it is a conflict between those gods and God. Not really much of a conflict. God's going to win, but it's kind of like you ever watched the movie Ben-Hur. There's a story about Charlton Heston in the chariot race, and he was very excited and they told him, "Relax, you're going to win the race." It's the same thing here. God is going to win regardless. Egypt was dominated by idolatry. Gods many and lords many, it says. There were thousands of temples, millions of idols, and behind all idolatry is one person, Satan. There was power in the religion of Egypt. Sometimes people don't realize that. Reading from 2 Timothy 3:8. Now Jannes and Jambres withstood Moses. So do those also resist the truth. Men of corrupt minds reprobate concerning the faith. Remember, we're going to find out that these magicians were able to duplicate some things, but God still won. Pharaoh asked over in chapter 5, "Who is the Lord that I should obey his voice to let Israel go? I know not the Lord, neither will I let Israel go." Interesting question. And so God introduced himself to Pharaoh in a very special way. Pharaoh got acquainted with God and acknowledged him as God. In chapter 10 of Exodus, we'll read this. "And Pharaoh sent and called Moses and Aaron and said unto them, I have sinned this time. The Lord is righteous, and I and my people are wicked. That's Exodus 9:37. Then in Exodus 10:16, then Pharaoh called Moses and Aaron in haste, and he said, I have sinned against the Lord your God and against you. Pharaoh was learning the hard way, but he never completely learns the lesson. So there's a question that always arises. Why the plagues? God could have just simply freed the people. He has that power. All things are possible. Why did he use the plagues? It was God's battle with the Egyptian gods. He was going to demonstrate not only to Israel, but to Egypt, that they are false gods and he is the one true God. Each plague was directed at a particular god of Egypt. In some cases, more than one god, because they had gods for everything. Gods for the sun, God for the moon, God for crops, God for rain, you name it, they had a God for everything. Exodus 12:12 tells us, for I will pass through the land of Egypt this night, and will smite all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, both man and beast, and against all the gods of Egypt I will execute judgment. I am the Lord. Notice, against all the gods of Egypt I will execute judgment. So God wanted to reveal to his own people that he, the Lord, was far greater than any god that the Egyptians worshipped, or later the Babylonians worshipped, or the Greeks, or whoever. And he had the power to deliver his people from the bonds of slavery. The authorship of this book has really always been attributed to Moses. Matter of fact, we have the greatest authorization of that over in Mark 12:26. And it's touching the dead that they rise. Have you not read in the book of Moses how in the bush God spake unto him, saying, I am the God of Abraham, and the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob? If there's any discussion, that just ended it. Jesus called it the book of Moses. All right. Moses is going to describe the plight of Egypt and the rise of a deliverer, that's himself, and the struggles with Pharaoh's very obstinate heart, which resulted in the really miraculous deliverance of the nation, even through the Red Sea, the Sea of Reeds, whichever you prefer, and their safe arrival at Mount Sinai. Now, we'll begin the actual study now that the introduction is over with. Beginning in verse 1. Now these are the names of the children of Israel, which came into Egypt. Every man in his household came with Jacob. Reuben, Simeon, Levi, and Judah. Issachar, Zebulun, and Benjamin. Dan, Naphtali, Gad, and Asher. And all the souls that came out of the loins of Jacob were 70 souls, for Joseph was in Egypt already. Now the names of the children of Israel, which came out of Egypt, every man there, we see that. That is a connecting thing. Remember I said that first word now could very easily be translated and, because it just connects one book with the other here. So it is a sequel, as I said, to Genesis. It keeps the story going. The death of Joseph concludes Genesis. Exodus 1:6 tells us that Joseph and all his brethren and all the generation died. 3.5 centuries have passed. Now in Genesis 46, God said that Israel will increase and multiply and become a great nation. And they did. So this informs us that Genesis and Exodus link together. There's no real break here. The story just continues. It's interesting here. You see Leah's 6 sons are listed in order of their birth, Reuben through Zebulun. Benjamin, the son of Jacob's favorite wife, second wife, Rachel, is mentioned next. But Joseph, Rachel's firstborn, isn't mentioned in this list, and it explains why. Moses tells us he's already in Egypt. He's been there for a good while. And then Dan and Naphtali, the sons of Rachel's handmaiden, and then Gad and Asher, the sons of Leah's maidservant. So the males who entered Egypt with Jacob numbered 70. Now Acts 7:14, then sent Joseph and called his father Jacob to him and all his kindred, 75 souls. That's following the Septuagint's reading. Now, are you familiar with the Septuagint? That's the Greek translation of the Old Testament. So this 75 included, that were mentioned there, the 75. This 75 included a son and grandson of Manasseh, and 2 sons and a grandson of Ephraim. Again, people like to look for contradictions in the Bible. They'll say, well, it says 70 here and 75 there. But it's not. All you have to do is read a little bit and study, and the Bible explains itself. So that total of 70 included 66 members mentioned back in Genesis 46:26, and plus Jacob and Joseph's 2 sons. So however, that total, including wives of Jacob's sons and grandsons and handmaidens, husbands of the daughters and granddaughters not listed, would have been greater than 70. But the 70 is the number we take. Remember, not everyone was numbered. Verse 6 says, and Joseph died, and all his brethren, and all that generation. And the children of Israel were fruitful, and increased abundantly, and multiplied, and waxed exceedingly mighty, and the land was filled with them. Jacob's descendants increased. It's amazing. And the children of Israel were fruitful, and increased abundantly, and multiplied, and were waxed exceedingly mighty. Over in Acts 7:17, but when the time of the promise drew near, which God had sworn to Abraham, the people grew and multiplied in Egypt. If you haven't figured this out yet, we're going to be using a lot of other scripture to explain things going on here to verify facts. So several generations, don't know how many, separated Levi from Moses, so that the time from Joseph's death to the growth of the nation described here in verse 7 was probably over 100 years. Now the census at Sinai, over in the book of Numbers, chapter 1, shows 603,000 males, 20 years and older. That would have been probably a quarter of the population, so you would have had a population of over 2 million, as I said before. And if you can actually work it out mathematically, and it shows that a 5% increase in population over those years would bring it to that total of about 2 million. No wonder, and the land of Goshen was filled with them. There was a great number of people. And this is according to God's promise over in Genesis 12. As he's talking about multiplying his seed, a great nation. He talks about as the stars of the sky or the sands of the beach. And we're beginning to see that here. But they had yet, though, as part of the Abrahamic covenant, received the land. Remember back in Genesis 15, in the same day the Lord made a covenant with Abraham, saying unto thy seed, I have given this land from the river of Egypt unto the great river, the river Euphrates. And he talks about all the lands of the Kenites, Kezanites, Canaanites, and all those. This is a constitution is coming, but it's not yet in place. That's the law, the Mosaic law that will happen at Sinai. So Moses discusses 2 forms of oppression in the reign of Pharaoh in the 18th dynasty there: slave labor and child extermination. God used these practices of Pharaoh to stir up the people to desire deliverance from Egypt. Something had to happen because we get comfortable. If we step up in time now to the Babylonian captivity, you remember they were free to go back, and so many of them stayed and assimilated into the Babylonian way of life. We get the book of Esther after people had returned. Sometimes God has to do things to prompt people to do what he wants, to prompt them to leave. And maybe Israel had gotten comfortable in Goshen. And so Pharaoh, by doing these things, causes Israel to want deliverance. Verse 8 says, "Now there arose up a new king over Egypt, which knew not Joseph. And he said unto his people, Behold, the people of the children of Israel are more and mightier than we. Come on, let us deal wisely with them, lest they multiply, and it come to pass that when there falleth out any war, they join also unto our enemies, and fight against us, and so get them up out of the land." Right there, it tells us something very important in verse 8. A new king over Egypt, which knew not Joseph. You know, there's always a generation who doesn't know. Today, there's a generation who's never heard about Jesus Christ. Many of our young people today have no knowledge of history. Many of them have no knowledge of the Depression. They have no knowledge of the Holocaust. They have no knowledge of these things. That's why it's necessary to teach every generation what happened in previous generations. Because if you don't learn from the past, you're going to repeat the same problems. And there arose a generation in Egypt who had never heard of Joseph and everything that he had done for them. At one time, Joseph was so well known in Egypt that he was a hero. And his body, they would not even let them take his body out of the land then. But this new Pharaoh came to power, and he wasn't too kindly disposed to Israel, and as his predecessors may have been. He did not really care for them. He thinks that they are growing too strong. Oh, what happens? There's so many of them. If we go to war and they would join the opposing army, they would take us over. And it's a real possibility that Israel could have joined forces with an army coming in against Egypt. Pharaoh wanted slaves. And a simple way to solve his problem was Israel. But if he was really concerned about Israel joining forces, the simplest thing for him to do would have been what? Send them on their way. He didn't do that. He didn't release Israel. He decided to use some worldly wisdom to take care of his situation he thought was very difficult for him. So therefore he set over them taskmasters to afflict them with their burdens, and they built for Pharaoh treasure cities, Pithom and Ramesses. So he enslaves them. He forces them to do hard labor. That will get people's attention when you enslave them and force them into labor. Now, they didn't build the pyramids. So often I hear people say, the Israelites built the pyramids. They didn't. The pyramids had already been in existence for many years before this happened. They were forced to build treasure cities. These were cities that honored the pharaohs. They also would hold weapons and treasuries and different things. They constructed the cities with bricks, which they, as slaves, were forced to make. In other words, there's the land, here's what you need, get busy. At the beginning of their slavery, the Israelites were actually provided with straw to make bricks. But as the persecution from the pharaohs got worse, they were compelled to hunt for their own straw. At the same time, they were to continue to make brick without shorting any, could continue the work. So Israel was in a very difficult situation now in Egypt. The Egyptian had made their lives hard and then harder every day. But it says in verse 12, but the more they afflicted them, the more they multiplied and grew. And they were grieved because of the children of Israel. God told Abraham that the Israelites were going to have a tough time in Egypt. Genesis 15:13 says, and he said unto Abraham, know of a surety that thy seed shall be a stranger in a land that is not theirs, and shall serve them, and they shall afflict them 400 years. Perfect prophecy, wasn't it? 3 things are predicted in that verse that God spoke to Abraham. The Israelites were going to be strangers in a strange land. They were going to be servants, that is, they were going to be slaves, and they were going to be afflicted. That's not the kind of news that you want to hear, is it? But that's the news that they got from God. And all of these predictions that God made came true. But here's the amazing thing. The more that the Egyptians afflicted the Israelites, the more they multiplied and grew. And the Egyptians made the children of Israel serve with rigor. So as we come to these verses now, this prophecy is taking place. And the children of Israel were fruitful and increased abundantly and multiplied and waxed exceedingly mighty, and the land was filled with them. Wow. Verse 8 indicates that a great change has taken place. Again, we talk about a Pharaoh which knew not Joseph. So things are difficult for them right now. But I want to talk again about knew not Joseph. Why is that important? You know, this is something that should be remembered. Knew not Joseph. Not because it was just Joseph. But we need to remember things about what's happened. We need to remember. You know, for example, there was an executive from Coca-Cola who was doing a commercial or interview, and he said that a portion of every bottle and every can that they sold went to advertising. And someone said, well, isn't that overkill? And they said, no, I don't think so. How about thinking about some of the products that aren't around anymore? Have you seen a Studebaker lately? No advertising. He said, Jim, you need to tell people, you need to advertise. Well, there arose in Egypt a Pharaoh who did not know Joseph. He needed to be told. Someone needed to be advertising. Just like Christians today, we need to be advertising Jesus Christ. I don't mean we go on TV and do commercials, but we need to tell people. We don't know about the name of this Pharaoh for sure, but we know one thing. He had no appreciation for the things that Joseph did for the nation. He didn't know Joseph's character or achievements, and he needed to. It's just like today, if we don't tell people about Jesus Christ, they're never going to know. And he's alarmed because of the children of Israel and aligning possibly with the enemy. And so we'll talk next week. We'll pick up in verse 11, because I promised to keep it at 30 minutes. So we'll pick up there.